And good evening to everyone out there, and thank you for your patience as we attempt to come into this broadcast. This is America Fails. Thank you for being with us, and I'm Janice Graham of Our Common Ground, and I'd like to introduce you to the senior producer of If America Fails, The Coming Tyranny, L. Michelle Odom. Good evening, Michelle.
Hello, 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 and welcome. Welcome. So glad to finally be here.
It's been a long time coming. It really has. We are pleased at Our Common Ground Media to be able to present this 12-week series because we think that this conversation, these discussions are urgently needed in this time and at this time. Michelle, give us an idea about what we're doing here at TruthWorks Network around If America Fails, and tell us about the website. And tonight, our episode 1 is America Under Siege, the Color of Autocracy. And we have invited Dr. David H. Icard, who's going to be with us at the last minute, had to call in due to an illness. And we have Professor Yates Sexton to carry us through this particular theme in this first episode of If America Fails.
So, Janice and I are both big fans of The Handmaid's Tale, both the book by Margaret Atwood and the HULU television series. And so I would say sometime last year we were talking about the TV series and at what was happening in the country, and saw some of a symmetry between the basic storyline of a United States that has failed, a United States has succumbed to some kind of theocratic regime. and is in the midst of creating this new kind of society, the Gilead. And so there's a battle going on between the United States and Gilead. Looks like Gilead is winning. Most uh, Americans have been running the country. A lot of them escaped to Canada. Those that weren't lucky enough to escape are living the horror of this new regime. And so, given the some of the kind of political events and get into those, we go through the series. But given some of the things that were going on in the country today, like the active effort to suppress the vote, to throw out our votes, to stop the steal, all of happening around the election, and this sort of gaslighting and double speak has become so commonplace. We felt like it was this, like maybe there was an opportunity to fictional story as a jump off point, a very popular fictional story. The book has won all kinds of awards. Margaret Atwood, the writer, has won all kinds of awards as well. TV show. So to take this very popular and well-known story, which has become really a part of a very common part of our dialogue. You all hear people now saying things like, "Oh, we're about to do the Handmaid's Tale." So what does that mean? If you're not a consumer of the book or the TV show. Wanted to take this popular story to what's going on in our world today, particularly in the United States. And so we have invited a series of experts, scholars, and other peoples to kind of help think through some of what we're seeing. And what we did was we looked at the major themes that go on and we built 12 weeks of discussions around the various themes. So tonight is our premiere. We had a sneak peek actually back over 14th where Dr. Karen Hoff joined us. She's going to be with us again, but she has written a book. She's a film scholar, and she has written a book called The Handmaid's Tale Teaching Dystopia. And we were kind of focused on the issue of the theme of fascism at that time, which is an ongoing theme to what we're seeing. Tonight's focus is democracy. And I guess in a nutshell, that's basically, did I answer all your questions?
You did, as always. One of the things that I think is important for us to understand that in the original, which I read at the time of publication, um, Margaret Atwood sets up this dystopian story, which is fiction, and inside of it shows America had lost a civil war and having been seized in many of the geographical areas and essentially having lost the war. In the Republic of Gilead, which is the setting for the story, there was great focus on obedience and punishment. And I think that in our theme tonight, one of the things that we must understand is that is the foundation of autocracy. Let me tell you and introduce our guest tonight. He is Professor Jared Yates Sexton. And if any of you really pay attention to the discourse across the internet and within resistance communities, you will know him from his podcast. He is the author of The People Are Going to Rise Like the Waters of War, A Story of American Rage. Now that's a book my mother would have loved to have read. The Man They Wanted Me to Be, The Toxic Masculinity and a Crisis of Our Own Making, and American Rule, How a Nation Conquered the World but Failed Its People. He's the co-host of the Muck Rake podcast and serves as an associate professor of creative writing at Georgia Southern University. And I think that we all are very fortunate to be able to have this discussion with him. And we thank him so much for joining us on this first episode to talk about the color of democracy, the color of autocracy. Whiteness is a plague on a tree. And I think that to embrace what that will mean in terms of destruction of the infrastructure for justice and freedom is just so essential. So now we're going to turn it over and welcome Professor Jared Yates Sexton. Thank you, Jared, for being here. We were so excited. Got to press the button. All these buttons.
I've lost your sound, Janice. There you go.
Hey, how's it going?
Okay, do you sound now?
Can you hear me?
I can't. Oh,
Technology's hard.
yes.
What the hell? Okay.
Yes.
So you're not
Janice
supposed
has
to
been doing radio for 5 years. I hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what we have is
Yeah. Janice has been doing
failure.
radio.
See, I don't do this YouTube shit. And this is exactly why.
To be honest, I've only done YouTube out of necessity. It's a decent medium, but it doesn't always cooperate.
Jared, thank you so very much for joining us tonight.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Al says in here all of us on YouTube. So that's good to know. Thank you, Al.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being invited to do this. I think this is a really important project. And unfortunately, it is a conversation that is not only needed, but it's a conversation that people are either unwilling to have or are afraid to have. And I have to tell you, to give you a little bit of background on myself and how I've arrived at this moment. Before I do that, I want to say that I think it's very apt that for the basis of this discussion that you have gestured towards The Handmaid's Tale. Because what we are actually looking at right now, the circumstances and the crises that we are facing, it is not just white patriarchal dominion. We are talking about white patriarchal theocratic dominion. The really frightening thing, and I'll get more into this as we go along, is that The Handmaid's Tale, while like a horrific, nightmarish dystopia, it might turn out to be dated by the fact that it was created and written in the era that it was, and the circumstances that we now face based with surveillance, technology, all of the tools that an aspiring theocratic dictator or authoritarian might have at their disposal could make The Handmaid's Tale look quaint almost in comparison. So I'm going to get more into that, but before I do, I want to give a little bit of background. I want to catch everybody up a little bit on what is going on, how we've arrived at this point, what the problem is, and what the specific threat is that we face. Today was a really terrible day. And I assume if you're tuning in right now, it means that you care about politics and that you pay attention, and that days like these are the kind that try your will and your patience, and it's demoralizing and crushing. What we watched today with the United States Senate and with the United States Supreme Court is we watched the mechanisms in place within the United States of America that are meant to thwart democracy and progress, and basically to crush human dignity underneath its heel. The United States Senate was created specifically by a group of wealthy white slaveholding men to privilege wealthy white slaveholding men. As they met and framed the Constitution of the United States of America, the conversations that they had, a lot of people are not very familiar with how the Constitution was actually framed and how it came about. It's a really damning indictment to look into the conversations in which these white, wealthy, slaveholding men made decisions that they were the rightful rulers of the world. And whenever we talk about the founding of the United States of America, we have this mythology where we talk about it as if, these men were inspired by divinity, or that they were moved towards liberty, equality, and freedom, when in fact the entire idea was to create a one-party system, to not have multiple parties, but to have a ruling, white, wealthy, slaveholding elite that controlled the United States of America and gave the illusion of representative democracy to everybody else, while denying humanity, citizenship, and even the idea that these people were human. We're talking about, obviously, slaves, women, and the poor. What happened today, and what we continue to watch with representative bodies like the United States Senate and the Supreme Court, it's by design. It's there to privilege the same people that it originally privileged, again, white, wealthy men for the most part. That is where we are today. And there is an incredible amount of danger that is building that people simply do not want to discuss. They do not want to look at. They want to bury their head in the sands and pretend that everything will be okay. The majority of this is done by a political and journalist media class that most of them are white and wealthy. And in order for them to accurately diagnose what is going on, it would mean admitting that they are part of the problem, that they profit from the problem, and that they have arrived at their places in their careers and in their lives in part because of a white supremacist patriarchal system. This keeps people from being able to see the forest, so to speak, or to see the problem. For myself, a little bit of background of how I've arrived at the point where I am. Back in 2015, 2016, kind of as a hobby, I was interested in politics. I started going to Donald Trump rallies. And as I was doing that, what I noticed was that something was gaining force and momentum and power within America. I saw some really ugly stuff in these rallies. I heard conversations among people about civil wars. I heard talk about arresting journalists and politicians, executing them. Obviously, I heard a lot of anti-democratic, authoritarian type activity. And back in 2016, as I was doing this and going into these rallies, I was suspicious. And I knew what I had seen, but I was not able to put together the puzzle pieces yet, because the American education system does not tell you what is going on. It does not explain why we have arrived at this current moment in our political and social situation. It doesn't present to us the vocabulary needed. It doesn't prepare us to recognize growing authoritarianism. It doesn't give us the ability to understand what is going on. In my own life, because I saw this and it freaked me out, quite frankly, and I started ringing the alarm bell, I was being told by people constantly, it was like, you're being hysterical. You have no idea what you're talking about. The American political system will spit Donald Trump out. There's no possibility that he could ever be president. This is just a fad. The people that you're hearing are not representative of a larger movement. And what I noticed, though, was that my instincts were proving correct, not just as Donald Trump was elected president of the United States of America, but as what I was witnessing started to coalesce and metastasize. Before I go forward and talk about what I've learned, I want to state very clearly and very definitively, this conversation that we're having tonight about the dangers that we're facing, this is not just about Donald Trump. And he is an incredibly dangerous individual. But Donald Trump is not an ideologue. Donald Trump is not a competent, principled person. Donald Trump is more or less a bull in a china shop who, through his self-serving narcissism and lack of utter shame, made it apparently clear to the right wing and to a lot of the people that I'm going to talk about tonight that liberal democracy, the United States of America, and the institutions that we have learned to trust, that they are broken. And not just broken, but that they could be overrun via authoritarian ideas. So as we talk about this, I will mention Donald Trump, but this is not just about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger disease. He is not the disease proper. This thing has been churning and growing for much, much longer than when Donald Trump came down the golden escalator in Trump Tower in New York City. So I've had to do the background research into what is happening. And to be honest, it is very clear how we've arrived at this point. It's very clear why we face the problems that we do. It's the denial and the delusion of the people who are responsible for trying to stop it or even to cover it and talk about it that exacerbates the problem. So what I want to do very, very quickly is get people up to date of how we have arrived where we are. And I've already started by talking about the founding, but I want to fast forward into the 1980s and the 1990s. And this is as the Cold War was coming to a conclusion. As the Cold War was finishing, there was room for something to change. As America was no longer facing the Soviet Union, there was room for expansion. A lot of people began to talk about the possibility that American-style liberal democracy and capitalism would be the final type of government, the final type of idea that would circle the world and lead to infinite peace, prosperity. It would allow all of us to sort of rise up into a mythical middle class. The problem is that was never going to be the case. The idea that we're getting ready to discuss is termed neoliberalism. And it's it feels a little bit strange when we start talking about what this is. We always assume that liberalism means the left or the Democratic Party. But neoliberalism is actually an ideology that is on both sides of the aisle. With the Democrats, the Republicans, independents, it has more or less taken over the entire ideological spectrum within the United States, but also around the world. This was introduced by not Ronald Reagan, but the think tanks and the millionaires and the billionaires who funded and more or less controlled Ronald Reagan. And as Reagan introduces this, there is an idea. And the idea behind neoliberalism is this. It's that the government should not invest in human projects. It shouldn't build people homes. It shouldn't invest in healthcare. It shouldn't invest in education. To do so would be tyrannical, right? Because what's most important about liberal democracy, neoliberals believe, is allowing the market to make decisions. It's allowing businesses and corporations because they are better than us. That's what they truly believe, much like the founders believed. If you have wealth, that means that you are better than everybody else. But the truth is, if you have wealth, it's because, for the most part, most of the time, it means that you have benefited from the privilege of being from a long line of wealthy people, and particularly being white men. So this game of letting loose these markets has gone around. This is why your healthcare sucks. This is why your dollar doesn't go as far as it used to. This is why there's hardly any such thing as a labor union anymore. Why you're worked harder, why you have to have multiple jobs is because the government has more or less been co-opted by the wealthy and the powerful at this point. They're not supposed to give you money. They're not supposed to aid you. They're not supposed to help you. Whenever there's something like a pandemic that happens, there's really not much that the government can do. One of the big glimpses that we got of this on a national or international stage was Hurricane Katrina. And of course, there were, prejudices that played into this, incompetence that played into this, but the government couldn't go and help people, right? Because that's not what the government does. The government makes sure that the economy works. And that's why we have this idea of essential workers. That's why we're just throwing people into the pandemic and expecting them to die for their jobs. Now, this idea of neoliberalism, one of the reasons why neoliberalism became the project of the world as it was birthed in America is because they don't want your vote to count, because they don't think that you're smart enough for your vote to count. You're not an expert. You're not reading all the polls. You're not educated like these people. You're not specialized in economics. How could you possibly ever, choose a candidate based on who would run the economy the best? And so what do they believe? They believe that democracy is incredibly dangerous, because if you are constantly making decisions about what the country should do, you might get in their way. You might mess up their business schedule. You might mess up their profits. So what neoliberalism does is it takes away your ability to vote and choose things, and it gives you what they call, quote unquote, consumer sovereignty, which means that you're not voting in the voting booth anymore. You're voting with your dollar. You're voting which corporation you're going to give your money. You're voting which healthcare company you're going to give your money. And so that kind of inoculates government away from you. That's one of the reasons why so much of this makes you feel powerless, is by design. They want you to feel powerless. The exact same way that the founders of the United States of America wanted you to feel powerless. And yet there's still this charade that goes on, right? We still go out and vote. We still elect presidents. We still elect senators and representatives and governors and all of that. And they do change your life based on things like whether or not you're going to have the ability to choose what you do with your body. Obviously we have a power structure at this point that is probably going to start going after gay Americans, transgender Americans, discriminating people of color across the board. That's the only thing that the government can do, is regulate those types of things. It can't help you. This is why Congress is in a gridlock all the time, because it's by design. The reason Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema do the things they do, and by the way, they're not the only Democrats who don't want to break the filibuster and don't want to give you money and don't want to aid or help the American people at all, is because they're neoliberals. They believe that the government shouldn't be in the business of doing those things. They would much rather meet and discuss things and then vote those things down, so nothing really happens. Now, another quick little note about neoliberalism: it really enjoys authoritarianism. As a matter of fact, it was birthed using authoritarianism and dictators. In particular, it happened in Chile in the 1970s and the 1980s, when Pinochet took over Chile after deposing a socialist leader. The neoliberals went into Chile because they loved the idea of being able to push their ideas using a dictator. Why? Because the dictator is more than happy to crush labor unions. The dictator is more than happy to make sure that everybody stays in line. There aren't going to be labor strikes. There's not going to be a lot of arguments. And on top of that, you can just pay people hardly anything because they're afraid of the dictator. And that's what they did in Chile. And you actually go back and you look at the neoliberals like Friedrich Hayek. He's one of these main neoliberal founders. They said it out loud. They loved authoritarians. They loved dictators. They actually believed that authoritarians and dictators, they actually protected property rights and profits more than democratically elected leaders. So you're seeing a little bit of where we're going here, which is that the power structure in the United States of America, they are fine with what's going on. As a matter of fact, they're not just fine with it, they're funding it. Because fascism comes from a point when capitalism is in trouble. When capitalism is in trouble, fascists come in, are usually paid by the people who have a ton of money and the corporations that have all the money. They pay the fascists and support them to make sure that you go to work, that your labor union is destroyed, and that you just shut up, and that you're so afraid of being brutalized by these people that you just go about your lives. So what I have just described is more of a quiet nightmare. This is a really, really hard time. It's demoralizing, it's crushing, it's frustrating. It's enough to make you lose any sense of hope. But when all this happens for so long, it kind of becomes a little bloodless because there's no purpose behind it beyond gathering profit and accumulating services for the wealthy. There's nothing that is rewarding. Like even before neoliberalism, people went to their jobs, they provided for their families, and yeah, they were tired at the end of the day and they didn't have a lot of money, but they got by and they were able to give their kids better lives. That mythology is going away. And what we find throughout history is that when mythologies that control societies go away, something needs to fill that vacuum. Something needs to give people purpose. That's where fascism comes from. Fascism and authoritarianism, particularly of the fascist variety, give people a purpose. They come along and they say, you don't have any money. And most of the time, they're talking to white men. They say, you don't have any money, you don't have any power. Put on the armband and you're going to have power. You're going to be part of something larger than yourselves. You can even give up your life for the fascist movement. In that case, what's actually happening is that fascists and authoritarians are injecting religious type meaning into a vacuum where people don't feel like they have anything that they can contribute, anything that they can do. And particularly white men who are frustrated, like they are in America, they gravitate to this stuff. America has had many close calls with fascism. In fact, after the Great Depression, we had a ton of fascist movements, including an American Nazi movement that had a massive rally in Madison Square Garden with tens of thousands of people there to talk and congregate and support the American Nazi Party while there was a swastika standing next to a portrait of George Washington. In fact, there was an attempted coup to take over from FDR to keep him from changing around things with the New Deal. The point of what I'm telling you is that you have been told for probably your entire lives, it couldn't happen here, not in America. America is exceptional. But America actually has deep, deep fascistic roots. The thing that has kept it from happening, for the most part, is on the ground organization. It's been the struggle against fascism by the people all along. What's happening right now, as we face this crisis of neoliberal meaning and we're frustrated and we don't feel like the government is there for us because, quite frankly, it's not there for us, we have options. We have not formulated an alternative. We have not figured out a different way to live that has taken hold and gained momentum. There are people who are working on that. And let me tell you who those people are. They are conservative nationalists, nationalist conservatives, or they are what's called traditionalist. These are people who believe that the problem with the world is that religion, and by the way, the obeyance of religion, has been taken out. And they look back into the 18th century when you have liberal revolutions in the United States of America and in France, and they say, you know what, you knock down the power of religion in government, right? Because we have the separation of church and state. In a liberal state, such as the United States, you say, you know what, the law doesn't come from a religious backing. It comes from my relationship to you, my liberty to do what I want, your liberty to do what you want, and where those two intermingle. The national conservatives and theocrats who are involved with this movement believe that the only way that we can move forward is by, much like they wanted to do, re-injecting religious control back into the public sphere. That means that they literally want to rewind the clock and go back to a period before liberal democracy existed. They don't care about democracy. They don't want more votes. That's not what they're interested in. They think that voting is a sham. They think that they are naturally better than you, much like the founders did, by the way. They believe that their vote should count for more than yours. which is why around the world you have seen the growth of illiberal democracy. This national conservative movement, and by the way, you probably saw this with Tucker Carlson going to Hungary to hang out with Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban scapegoated immigrants. He also talked about conspiracy theories, which, by the way, is a different way of explaining neoliberal globalism with, secret shadowy forces, including always, the idea of Jewish puppet masters, internal traitors, all of that. It goes ahead and it spiritualizes what has actually happened economically and politically. So over in Hungary, Viktor Orban took over the government by scapegoating immigrants and by talking about George Soros and other Jewish puppet masters who were taking over the country. So what did they do? They rigged the elections. They censored the media. They took over the educational system. They closed their borders, and they created an illiberal democracy. The National Conservatives want that. This is why they're doing everything that they're doing. They want to put in an order, a religious order, in which they would be at the top of the hierarchy. They call it natural right. They believe that some people are superior to others. By the way, it's always white, wealthy men, in case you're keeping track. And what they want to do is they literally want to overrun liberal democracy, just completely dismantle it, and create a new theocratic illiberal state. So what would that look like? How would that occur? What would our lives be like under this illiberal theocratic state? The chances are, at first, it would be kind of tense. There would be a lot of rioting. There would be fights in the street. There would be protests that would probably end up with blood running into the gutters. Because what they always do as they're cracking down on human rights and liberal democracy is they have to make people shut up. They have to make sure that you are afraid to go out and say, no, this isn't okay. I demand that I have my rights. They have to take those fascists, those thugs, and put them out in the street in order to crack your skull so you're afraid to go out there. The people that they can, they'll intimidate into silence. The other people, they'll get rid of. And we have to consider also with global climate change looming, they're going to have to get rid of a lot of people. And that's something that can lead to some really horrific circumstances. But at first, there will be clashes. And this goes back again to the Handmaid's Tale. That is something that Atwood talks about here. There are the initial sort of civil war moments. A lot of it's going to be scattered violence. You're going to see some states that are going to move away and form coalitions with other states. It's going to be a balkanization of the United States. And I want to put a little bit of a pin in this and say, I don't think this is inevitable. I think that we're going to fight this back. I have thoughts on how we can do that, but let's go ahead and talk about the consequences so we can get serious about this. So at first, that's what happens. But here's the terrifying thing, and this is something that Atwood gets right in her book. There are a lot of people who will go along with it. A lot of people like to look at Nazi Germany and Italian fascism, and they say, Hitler and Mussolini hypnotized people. Their speeches were too good. That's not what happened. What happened was that people had an economic and political reason to go along with it. The middle class in Italy and the middle class in Germany, they were fine with it because they weren't attacked. They weren't discriminated against. The Nazis and the fascists made sure that they were able to keep their property, that they were able to keep their jobs, that they were able to keep their places in society. You will have people in America, and we think about this, the idea that there could be some sort of theocratic dictatorship. We think that everybody will be in the streets fighting. That's not true. Not true at all. There would be some people who would welcome it, they would engage in it, and there would be other people who accept it and watch it and just don't say anything. They let it happen because it benefits them. And what happens after that? You start to see a crackdown. You start to see all of these tendrils of autocracy moving and working their way through. This is one of the reasons that we're dealing with the CRT situation. I should say CRT because it's not actually critical race theory. What they're actually trying to do, and I see this throughout history over and over and over again, is that you have people, particularly autocrats and authoritarian figures, they go in and they make the teachers teach a different type of history. They make sure that all of their studies and all of their classes and all of their lessons are about how great the country is and how great the rulers are. And they make sure that they, downplay the idea of protest or organization or even human rights. So that starts changing the way people think about the world. Meanwhile, the state becomes its own religion. They start looking at America, which is one of the reasons why Christian nationalism is on the rise. They start looking at things like the founding and they say, you know what, they didn't try and divide the church and state. What they actually tried to do is create a godly country. They were inspired by divine powers. The only reason that they do that is in order to increase their own power and their own control. So you'll have Christian nationalists who will say, you know what, the basis of America is Judeo-Christian values. So here are all the laws. All of a sudden, gay Americans are fast up against the wall. Women become subjugated because that is one of the bases of the Christian law that they believe. You're going to see white supremacy run just absolutely rampant because Christian nationalism in the United States of America is run completely through with white supremacy. And then on top of it, here's a problem. Here is a major, major problem. We have created, in the last few decades, the largest surveillance system in the world. All of these corporations, who, by the way, you want to talk about Google, you want to talk about Apple, you want to talk about Facebook, you want to talk about any of the biggest corporations in the world, they work with authoritarians. They went over to China, and what did China say to them? They said, we need this stuff censored so we can control people. And they were like, yeah, absolutely. Just make sure that we're able to get the money and get the power. They're more than happy to work with authoritarians. In this case, the surveillance state that an authoritarian regime in the United States would use, you may not know this, it's already powered by these companies. Whenever the war on terror began, the United States did not have the technology they needed to surveil people around the world and within its own borders. They had to go to Facebook, they had to go to Apple, they had to go to Google. Those people are the ones who run the technocratic functions of the United States of America. And they have all of the access to all of your data, everything that you've ever said online, every site that you've ever gone to, everything that you have ever said in confidence with other people. All of that is there. And I have to tell you, Margaret Atwood, for all of the nightmarish visions that she had in The Handmaid's Tale, she did not imagine just how technologically based this surveillance state could possibly be. Within The Handmaid's Tale, the horror is that there are spies among you, and there will certainly be spies among you. But that surveillance state that was created during the War of Terror, and which keeps growing and growing and growing, in which the United States looks for what they call total information awareness, which involves everything that you write, everything that you say on the phone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine that in the wrong hands. Imagine that in the hands of people who are desperate to purge heretics, who are desperate to purge people who don't believe their orthodoxy, or people who oppose them politically. On the surface, from the outside, it would be disturbing probably. Like if you were in Canada and you were in Europe, you'd look at it and you'd say, God, the Americans are getting really weird and religious and patriotic, and it seems very, very strange. But underneath the surface, it would be almost total control. The frightening thing in all of this, the chapter, again, something that Atwood wasn't able to see back at that time because the only people who knew about global climate change were the oil companies who were well aware of it starting in the 1970s. Some of them in the 50s, actually. You got to consider what happens as the country shrinks, as the waters rise, and all of a sudden you have millions of climate refugees going from one state to the next. You have millions of climate refugees coming over the border. Suddenly you have excess people, you have shrinking resources, and you have an authoritarian regime that doesn't care about human life. Look what they did at the border under Donald Trump. They sterilized people. They kept them in cages. They put children in cages. And that's only the start of it. Because this authoritarian regime that we're talking about tonight would be very militaristic. And chances are it would glorify American empire. It would talk about the need for violence and overthrowing democratic rights in order to carry on the glory of America, which is what fascism wants and what fascism does. The idea that we are facing, the threat that we are dealing with that I've just outlined, that actually goes ahead and takes the Handmaid's Tale and just ups it in ways that we couldn't even fathom maybe the first time we ever read it. It is one of the most nightmarish hellscapes I think that anybody could ever cook up. And all points are moving in that trajectory. They're all going in that direction at this point. We can't afford to let that happen. And we have to find a different type of meaning, because neoliberalism has hollowed out our lives to the point where it's made us feel like everybody else is a competitor. It's made us feel like we're competing for the last dollar, right? We have to get ahead. We're like crabs in a bucket trying to get on top of one another. Our relationships have soured. Our jobs have soured. All of these things, we feel alone. We feel isolated. We feel powerless. It's an illusion. If we can rediscover solidarity and we can rediscover trust and working together, there's way more of us than there are them. And I have to tell you, if there starts to be some momentum to dismantle neoliberalism and take down this theocratic national conservatism, we'll win and we'll knock this fate back. But you have to be clear-eyed about it. You have to understand what we're actually facing, because this thing is ugly in a way that I don't think most people can even begin to put their heads towards. I think we'll beat it, but in order to beat it, you have to understand it. You have to know what it is, and you have to know where it's going. I think I got some time left. I'm happy to talk about this, take some questions. But again, I just want to say thank you so much for having me in here and letting me talk about this.
So much for coming. I tell you, Jared, dear, I know you laid out there, but I'm still stuck on the Handmaids is quaint compared to what we're facing. Oh God, I was hoping that because the Handmaids is a TV show, and I do actually know people that don't want a Handmaid's Tale because they don't like those kinds of visual images. But there are millions of people who do watch it. Yep. And I'm hoping that if you watch that kind of thing, you have sufficient courage to face what it is we're facing right now.
Yeah, and I have to tell you that I think one of the real benefits, because I've been teaching dystopian literature for a very long time. I've been studying it, thinking about it. Dystopian literature, what it does is it gives voice to both anxieties that are imagined, but also anxieties that are very, very real. And one of the reasons, of course, that The Handmaid's Tale gets written is because of the conservative revolution in the United States of America. And what you saw with that is Atwood, and again, an absolute brilliant turn by Atwood, is that Atwood recognized that behind the glittery exterior of people like Margaret Thatcher and people like Ronald Reagan and all the flag waving and all of that, that there were really dangerous currents, right? There were really dangerous thoughts that were being paved over. And of course, one of the worst things that Ronald Reagan ever did is that Ronald Reagan took white supremacy and gave it a veneer, right? He was able to say in this really disgusting thing in the 1980s, he would say, racism's over. There's no such thing as racism anymore, right? All laws and all ideas are now colorblind, which is preposterous, absolutely preposterous, especially as white supremacy and as, entrenched power were constantly beating away at voting rights and individual liberties. And so Atwood looked at that and said, I'll tell you what, I'll pull the curtain back for you. I'll tell you what's actually happening here and where this thing is going. And the really amazing thing, and this is why The Handmaid's Tale works not only in the novel form, but in the television show form, she nailed it dead to rights. She knew exactly what was in these people's hearts. And I didn't mention this in the presentation, and I will real fast. You'll also notice in The Handmaid's Tale that it is a theocratic authoritarian regime, but they're also all hypocrites. right? Because, and this isn't about Christianity. This isn't about actual religion. This is about people using that as a weapon, right? That's about people using an ideology to hurt people. You can be a Christian without wanting to enslave other people. You can have Christian values without wanting, to turn women into incubators and without wanting to take away people's personal rights. It's people who recognize the advantage. So, for instance, I mentioned the national conservative movement that's growing, right? I mentioned the traditionalist. And if you want to lose some sleep this weekend, everyone, go and look these two groups up. But what you will find with both of them, they don't actually believe in this stuff. They don't actually believe in Christianity. They think it's a really useful idea, right? They think it's a great story that you can trap people in and make them obedient. But if you look at Gilead, if you look at Gilead within the Handmaid's Tale, what you notice is the most powerful people, they don't believe this stuff. They work within it, right? Because they want to benefit themselves. And so Atwood killed it. Absolutely killed it in the way that she put this forward, but she couldn't have known about the surveillance state. She couldn't have known about the internet. She couldn't have known about total information awareness.
Let me go back, Jared, to some of the points that you made. I think sometimes escapes people who are watching this and don't have a refined way in which to examine it, even when it is in front of them.
Yep.
And that is to go back to how 9/11 did create the surveillance industrial complex, because it doesn't really come just from the government.
Yep.
It also comes via the capitalist system.
Yep.
Of how data is collected.
Yep.
The other is that I think that when people see people like Louis DeJoy, who is named the Postmaster General, who is also a major stock owner of 3 of the major competitors of the United States Postal Service,
Yep.
Yet he becomes the Postmaster General with the intent of debilitating it so that the companies where he is invested
can profit
from.
Yeah, and to go along with that, one of the things that people don't talk about within the Trump administration, of course, which DeJoy is obviously a side effect of, and should be kicked out on his ass today. The fact that he's not is an absolute blemish on the current state of things. What happened within the Trump administration, and of course he would tell people, of course, that he was going to drain the swamp, right? He was going to give power back to the people. It was the biggest grift that has been perpetrated on the American people since the beginning of the country, more or less. And what Trump did is he put in place people who wanted to destroy the departments that they were in charge of. Of course, you have DeVos, who goes into the Department of Education. Betsy DeVos, the entirety of her focus is on destroying public education so that it can be privatized, so that people like her can go in and buy schools and provide education at a huge markup and get amazing amounts of public funds, right? You've, of course, got Scott Pruitt over at the EPA, who, I think he was in the middle of a lawsuit against the EPA when he was put in charge of it. Rick Perry famously wanted to destroy the Department of Energy. He couldn't even remember the name of it and was then put in charge of it. You have Ben Carson, who, of course, wants to get rid of public housing. When you look at all of this stuff, what you start to realize, and this is neoliberalism personified, neoliberalism wants to destroy all public works, right? Because they don't believe that public works work. They think that automatically makes them faulty, and that all you need to do in all given times is to privatize. You just get companies in there to take care of these things. And I'm glad that you brought up 9/11, because if you actually look at the war on terror, yes, we sent our soldiers in there to die. But the moment that those corporations and the contractors could go into the war zones, they went in. And we got something wrong about the war in Iraq, unfortunately. Everybody said, oh, America wants the oil, right? Bush wants the oil. That's not what happened. The United States military went and got the oil and gave it to corporations. Because what actually you see within the war on terror was an opening up of markets. It was the privatizing of closed markets. Because in Iraq, it was a closed market. You couldn't go in there and sell your wares. You couldn't go in there and get the oil. So we went in, we paid for it. We sacrificed our lives, our blood, and our treasure in order for companies to go in there and do it. And one of the great tragedies is that George W. Bush believed in it. He truly thought he was in the middle of a crusade. He truly believed it was a fight between good and evil. And everybody behind him from Dick Cheney to Wolfowitz to Rumsfeld, they all knew that they were running a scam. They knew that they were going in, they were getting those markets, they were getting those resources. So what we've been talking about for so long is a different game. We're talking about the United States of America. They're talking about international markets, right? Mm-hmm. They're at 30,000 feet and we're down here on the ground. And it just so happens that we have not been able to put that information together. And meanwhile, they've created a perfect scenario and a perfect machinery for destroying protests, destroying ideas, and creating exactly what you were talking about, which is the surveillance industrial state.
Mm-hmm. There's another part of neoliberalism.
And now they're in space.
Yeah, now they're in outer space.
There's another part of one of my concerns, Jared, is that these things, when put in a certain kind of framework, are right before us.
Yep.
For instance, we did not recognize that George W. Bush, when he was in office, one of his goals was to eliminate federally funded housing.
Yep.
The way in which he did that was to offer poor working people mortgages that they could not afford.
Yep.
So we see that in the U.S. Postal Service now, during the Trump election. No one was talking about why the industrial complex, from pharmaceuticals to the medical institutions to most large organizations, to ALEC, and the rest, would deem to fund a moron like Donald Trump with no experience with his criminal pushing up, supporting his what I call global criminal empire.
Yeah, and Donald Trump was I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, we just end up with a class of grifters that were able to exploit.
Yeah, so there's a thing that happens within the corporate world which actually explains Donald Trump really incredibly well. So, whenever we think about corporations, automatically, and it's because we've been conditioned by the presidency to think this way, right? Whenever you look at a corporation and you see the CEO, right, you think that's the leader of the corporation. That's the one who does everything. That's the one who controls, all of the strings. But you actually have a bunch of corporations that are controlled by boards, people that you would never know their name, people that, there are interest and shareholders that you would never, ever even come across their name, even if you went looking for them. Sometimes they really like to go out and get a CEO who is more than happy to sign all of the incriminating materials and give the go-ahead to everything, and they're just happy to be there and get paid and let corruption grow and grow and grow. Donald Trump was the perfect individual in this case. It was more or less a death blow of the government as a public good. It was somebody who was shameless, somebody who was dangerous, somebody who didn't care about America, has never cared about America. And if you actually start to look at it through that worldview, you start realizing things like him talking to Vladimir Putin and welcoming Russian intelligence. That's just international business, right? We're not talking about a country anymore. We're talking about using any advantage that could possibly be there, which is what corporate ethos tells you. The only people who get ahead in corporations are the people who push the envelope. And they all know that, you break the laws, and you break the laws until you get caught, and then you pay the fine. But you still profit and you still go forward. Donald Trump was the perfect embodiment of that. And what he did was he proved to everybody who was afraid of, things like duty, American rules, laws, all of those, he proved that none of those things existed anymore, that the guardrails were gone. You could get away with literally anything that you wanted at any given time. But he was the perfect stooge for that. He was the perfect battering ram for these people that we're talking about to really put him in place and use him as a weapon.
Let me do a follow-up, and I want to jump in here, Michelle. But one of the things that I am concerned about, and my hashtag on Twitter is trust your struggle.
Yep.
That with all of the chaos and noise that has been created in the last 20 years, I'm saying 20 years, and
Yep.
and I've been broadcasting on these issues during that time frame, that are looking for saviors.
Yep.
And I think that my hashtag is trust your struggle, and that is that we have to keep our eye on the victims and not the chaos and the confusion. That resistors have to become people who understand and stand for poor and working people. Now, when you go to the Handmaid's Tale story, one of the things that is so distinct, Public of Gilead, are the classes of both
Yep.
men and women. It is also, if you read the book, if you watch the TV, I keep saying, wow, who Handmaid's Tale white? You have to look for the average Black person, and there are some issues there. But one of the things is that we have not done, and that is teach generations of Americans how to practice democracy. Yes. And in that neglect, we are open to autocracy. And I'll wait for comments from both of you on that.
Yeah, I would just go ahead and say I don't think that you could have got that more right. And I'm glad that you took it back 20 years, because this is something that needs to be said more and more. Everyone who says they could never steal an election is forgetting that the election of 2000 was stolen out in the wide open, and that everybody went back to work the next day. And everybody just went forward as if it didn't happen. And we still pretend like it wasn't a stolen election. So that's number one. The second thing is, we have not been given the information or the education to understand what's going on. Whenever we get taught history, whenever we get taught the American story, whenever we get taught civics, whenever they actually do teach civics, they don't tell you what fascism and authoritarianism is, right? They don't get into that. They don't tell you how to recognize it in the country, because we're told it could never possibly happen in America. In fact, we get a fairy tale. And the fairy tale is that there was fascism at one moment, but we defeated it and it went away. And that was it. As if it was an aberration, as if it was a phenomenon in Western Europe in the 20th century. It's not. It's something that every country deals with. And America has a long, long history of dealing with it. And whenever you look at all of that, you start to realize, oh my God, we're ignorant of what this possibly could be. We're kept intentionally from understanding it. And on top of that, they have made politics a TV show.
I think that one. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's a television show at this point. You're exactly right. Looking for saviors. That's the biggest problem. We're supposed to believe, it's almost like mythological characters. We're supposed to believe that Nancy Pelosi has a secret plan. Chuck Schumer has a secret plan. No, Mueller's going to knock Donald Trump down. When in fact, what we actually need to do is remember that democracy takes boots on the ground, takes individuals, it takes leaders that we can trust one another, build solidarity, and build organizations. We have to remember that democracy is more than marching off to the ballot booth every 2 to 4 years, because that is a recipe for letting authoritarianism take control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Michelle, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'd like to. My question is related to one of Jared's books, and I'd like to read the description for that. The book is The Man They Wanted Me to Be, Toxic Masculinity, and a Crisis of Our Making. The author of The People Are Going to Rise Like Waters Upon Your Shore turns his key eye to a crisis of masculinity using his upbringing in rural Indiana to examine the personal and societal dangers of the patriarchy. Based on his provocative and popular New York Times op-ed, The Man They Wanted Me to Be is both memoir and cultural analysis. Jared Yates Sexton alternates between an examination of his working class upbringing and historical, psychological, and sociological sources that examine the genesis of toxic masculinity and its consequences for society. So, Jared, I am wondering what your perspective is on how our families shape our orientation to leadership and governance styles, and what we might do is broken out of that conditioning. So, what strategies we might have. And I wanted to say, I saw your bourbon the other night. Well, two things. I love it when you open the can of beer.
Can we have bourbon on here now?
Hey, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. I was going to bring it on, but I didn't want to be presumptuous.
I saw your bourbon talk, and I was happy to know that you are in the process of directing your focus to, start to get all of this mess. So family background kind of perspective.
Yeah, so I thank you so much. That's all very kind, and I appreciate that. That was a hard book to write. For people who don't know this, the book is basically about how I grew up in a really abusive, patriarchal, white supremacist type environment that was absolutely riddled through with everything that we're talking about here, which is one of the reasons I recognized what was going on in the Trump movement pretty early on. I want to say very clearly that what we're talking about so far, we've been talking about economics, we've been talking about politics. We haven't talked about psychology in totality yet. And part of the problem is that there is a crisis in the United States of America. There are a lot of people who have been abused. There are a lot of people who have gone through a lot of trauma, who have done a lot of suffering. They haven't been able to heal. Maybe they don't even understand that they need to heal. Maybe they don't even understand that mental health is an actual thing. The relationship that Donald Trump has with his supporters is an abusive relationship. And it mirrors the type of patriarchal, abusive relationships between men and boys. And basically, the idea of masculinity as we know it is based on a cycle of abuse. It's based on little boys being told that they can't have emotions, being beaten, being emotionally and verbally abused, often by older men or their peers who have also been abused, and then growing up and doing the same thing to their children and other people around them. The problem in all of this, besides the human suffering of it and the personal suffering, is it does have political and social consequences. Right? It actually does create in people, like when you look around at fascist movements, it's a bunch of insecure men who feel like they have to be strong, They have to, you know, it's the old idea, you're either a killer or you are killed. And so all of these fascist movements, they always find men who are insecure about themselves and they feel powerless, right? They feel like the world has left them behind. They also feel like that they have been not just abused by society, but betrayed by society, right? In Nazi Germany, it's the loss of World War I. In Italy, it's the political and economic discord and the loss of, you know, some Catholic values within the masculine world. In the case of America right now, you have a changing masculine environment. Men used to get told, what do you do when you get older? You go and you work in a factory, you go and you work in a coal mine, you do manual labor that shows that you are strong, you don't complain about what you're doing, and you give your body basically to your family, right? Or you give your body to your country. The economy changed. Going back to neoliberalism, we deindustrialized. All of our factories moved elsewhere, right? You couldn't just go get a job in a factory, except for certain people in my family. You know, coal mines, they started sort of going downhill. There weren't as many, or they closed and they moved. So what you ended up having were a bunch of traumatized, abused white men who, by the way, had been told that they deserved the world, right? That they were the masters of the world. They were the best possible people. They were the kings of the world. And all of a sudden, they're not able to do those old masculine things. So what do? They start buying giant trucks. They start dressing in paramilitary, neo-fascistic gear, right? This is why you have all these men in big giant trucks with Punisher skulls on them, right? They are all buying weapons. They're pretending to be fascist. But the more that you pretend to be fascist, you become fascist, right? After a while, pretending to be a character, it's an outfit that you put on until it's an outfit you can't take off. And what we're watching in this country is a bunch of these people who've been traumatized and abused and who desperately need help. They need some type of help and healing. They're being told by people like Donald Trump, by people like Steve Bannon, they're being told, you don't need help. You're perfect. Everybody else is the problem. You are perfect. Get mad, get pissed off, pick up a gun, and do whatever you need to do.
So there seem to be quite a few, I don't know how many, but it should be zero, but quite a few Black men that have been attracted to the Trumpian kind of message. And, you know, that's hard to make sense of, but what you're saying makes sense of it. Yeah. So
let me, I have another question.
Yeah.
To a point that I would like to hear Jared discuss. And that is that many people who only inside the Trump administration for years paid attention to what was going on in their communities and in this nation. And they're trying to catch up. But catching up at this point means that you're always running behind the car, the bus. And people are concerned about how is it, what can I do, how do I get engaged, how do I become part of the resistance? And that really means or points to that people have to begin to see themselves, their investment in this democracy under which a failed United States democracy means for not only them, but for the entire country. What are your comments? What are your suggestions to those people?
Yeah, so that is the big giant question. That's what I'm working on right now. I'm trying to put together a plan of action, and I've been talking. It's funny enough we're having this conversation right now. I've been really picking this up over the past few days and having some really serious conversations. I think the basis of it is that we have been alienated from one another by design. We have been taught not to trust each other, that you are my economic competitor, and if you get ahead, I can't get ahead. That we have no common interest, because neoliberalism, it builds off the capitalistic idea that self-interest makes everything work, right? Selfishness is the only thing that you can ever trust. There are winners and there are losers, and I'm going to make sure you're a loser and I'm a winner. So what have we seen? We've seen labor unions absolutely crushed. We've seen communities driven away from each other. We've actually seen, as you've seen the factories go away, we actually aren't even working with each other all that much anymore. We're on Zoom. We're on all of these things, right? We can't talk about what we're getting paid, how we're being treated, what's going on in the world. So we're being atomized. And by the way, atomization, and when we're not talking to one another, that is the perfect situation for radicalization. That's where you say, put on this armband, put on this uniform, come along, grab a gun, you'll be great. So here's what I think needs to happen. You're exactly right. So many people are behind. And I personally, I'm behind. The only reason I'm having this conversation with you right now is because over the last 6 years, I've had to put in like 12-hour days of work studying this stuff. You know what I mean? Writing these books and getting the information and all of that. This didn't start for me until I was 34 years old. And I knew politics. I paid attention to politics, but I paid attention to conventional politics, the story that you see on TV. People have to get educated. They have to understand what's going on, because we have to understand the problem in order to find the solution. But I think in the meantime, what we need to find are the people who have led the struggle from the consequences. So I'm talking about people who have led strikes. I'm talking about people who have been in opioid communities, who have made sure to take care of mutual care. We need to find the community organizers who have dealt with the fallout from poverty and inequality and racism and sexism. Because what we need to do is we need to find politicians, representative organizers who are capable of organizing and have people's trust. Right? Because we have to rebuild that solidarity. We have to remember that we can depend on one another. And here's the thing about all of it. Whenever people say, what can I do? I tell them, talk to people. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, have real actual conversations. Start trusting each other, because you're being gaslit all the time. You're being told that this stuff isn't actually occurring while it's absolutely occurring. You have to find common ground and common reality in order to do anything. But I will say, and this is something that I don't think a lot of people believe, but it's true. When these things gain momentum, when the spirit of solidarity and trusting and community organizing, when you start remembering that you have power, it picks up speed real fast. You can change, like the moment that I would liken this to the most is the Gilded Age, which people who don't know, around the beginning of the 20th century, all of the corporations had complete control. They owned the government. They were able to charge whatever they wanted. People were living just squalorly lives because they were being oppressed. And then people woke up and they said, I'm tired of this shit. I'm tired of living like this. This isn't right. And they started forming community groups, and they started engaging in these progressive politics. And by the way, the progressive movement wasn't perfect. It had racism in it. It had classism in it. It had a lot of issues. But what it did show us was this: spontaneous growth of trust and spontaneous growth of an idea can turn into a giant fire. It can turn into a giant flame that can change the entire world. The only reason that we feel the way we do right now, that we are powerless and that we are alone, is because a lot of very, very powerful, wealthy people have spent a lot of money and a lot of political capital convincing us that we are powerless and we are alone. So we have to rediscover democracy, which involves education, organizing, and action. And if we can rediscover that, and if people do it all over the place, we can find a conflagration. We can actually figure this thing out, I think.
Well, I'm hoping that we will begin to formulate some of the strategies that are required, because we now know that white supremacists have embedded themselves in our state. House of Representatives and Senates, in our governorships, that there are silent, uh, autocratic would-be's in our Congress.
Yep.
And one of the things that we have to be as resistors is to be brave and bold.
Yep.
That we have to, if we have to do it, in the old days when I was a member of the Black Panther Party, we went door to, if we could get 5 houses when everybody in the house out, or one apartment building, to do civics lessons, to do planning around both needs and demands for social change. And I think we have to go back to that particular model.
I agree.
The other is to understand that we cannot be deluded into thinking that there is a anti-autocratic political infrastructure in place.
Not at all.
That we can't the political the government system under which our Congress operates, as you said very early in this presentation, is not designed to assist Americans.
No.
So when we go out and we celebrate the likes of those who are at least giving voice to a new progressive ideology, and we celebrate them, AOC, Cori Bush, and just a few others, we can't think that that is the answer.
Yep.
Because in the Atwood story, when you see the punishment, the torture, the repressive and oppressive laws which come down on the characters in that story, there was no amount of resistance in the government that could have prevented it. And Margaret Atwood was very smart. Most of the horror stories that we see in the story are things that she insisted writing rules was that no event or punishment or terror that appears in the story has not occurred in human existence history.
Yep.
So I think that we have to be, when we look at this story, for instance, I was appalled at the taking of a Black child from her parents and turning her over to a strange, crazy family. And that is a point that we have to think about. And when you bring up how immigrant children were put into cages, they were also separated from their family for 5 and 6 years, which is a lifetime of trauma.
And there's something to talk about with that unfortunately not a lot of people are talking about. Mm-hmm. There is a population situation happening in this country. This is why you have people like Tucker Carlson talking about great replacement theory, right? The idea that we're bringing in immigrants to replace, good Christian Americans. And one of the things that we find throughout history, and this is really disturbing, is that when authoritarian regimes, particularly with a religious tint, the way that this American movement is taking form, when they take control, they have population problems, right? Because there aren't as many of them as everybody else, right? They don't overpopulate everyone. So what do? They take children. And they take children from the groups that they oppress. They take children from their enemies, and they rehome them with loyalists. This happened in Spain. This happened in Chile. And quite frankly, this is a type of a situation that we would see as the quote unquote good white Christian population in the United States of America dwindles if we have a problem with immigrants, which we are almost certain to have because corporations and the wealthy depend on exploiting immigrant labor and will not let them accrue anything approaching a sustainable civilization for themselves, what you just brought up is something that we could definitely see going forward, which is you solve the problem by turning other populations, quote unquote, white. And that is what the white race has done over and over and over again. For people who don't know the history of American immigration, Italians were not white, right? They were considered a minority before the white population in the United States of America needed allies in numbers. And what ends up happening is it starts absorbing, it starts changing. But you're right, the child problem, I think that type of a thing is a preview of the type of stuff that we could see. And I just saw somebody in the chat said this happened in Canada. Absolutely it did. It happened with Native American children. And it is the process of oppression and assimilation that white supremacy has always done. And the unfortunate part of all of this, white supremacy, which has been probably the most dangerous force in the history of the world, what it does, it continues to do. It doesn't make up new stuff. It just continues the same playbook. So what you're talking about, Janice, I think that is completely on the board. Is that is there's a problem that they need to solve, and that is their natural way of solving it. And that should frighten people. That is really frightening stuff.
Mm-hmm. Michelle,
And I just posted an article a few days ago at our website, by the way, which is If America Fails Live. And it's chock full of events and background information on the Handmaid's Tale and bios on all the lists and words and ways to fight fascism. I just learned a new word today, in fact, unseen is like somewhere mid democracy and autocracy. And,
I'll get a 2-page report tomorrow on that.
But I posted an article. I posted an article there recently. I may get the numbers wrong, but I believe they said that thus far, the Biden administration has been able to return 100 of the children to their original families. There are about 350 additional children that they kind of have a line on. But of 500 children taken during the Trump administration, the article doesn't even go into what happened to them. You know, so you cause this destruction, and really there's no way, you know.
But the point, but Michelle, we all know that the point of a autocratic system is fear.
Yep.
If you lay the foundation for fear, if you have people traveling through a society of punishment and fear and trauma, they will not ask the questions about the solution.
Yes.
Because their lesson, and it was certainly a lesson. I mean, we can't, I agree with Jared. We can't get into the idea that this all started with Trump. It was unleashed publicly with Trump, but this started in the, I mean, I'm going to be 72 years old next week. So I'm going to say this started in the Nixon administration, where fear, punishment, and trauma was weaponized against American citizens. We have forgotten that people who did not agree with this government were murdered in their bed. We have forgotten that there has been murder under the cover of law in this country for many years. We have forgotten that this government, the democratic process was seized because the 1% or because people couldn't tolerate the idea that there was an African American man in the White House.
Yeah.
So, not new, but in front of us.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up Nixon, because that was the moment in American history where things shifted over. There was an attempt by the government up until that point to do things to help American citizens. They would pass legislation, they would create agencies. But eventually what happens is that the government, they start to see the people as the enemy. They start to see the people as a population that needs to be controlled, right? They see disorder in the streets. They see revolutionary activities. So what do? They go beyond all Bill of Rights. They go beyond every civil liberty imaginable. They open people's mail. They send law enforcement into these groups. Hell, this sounds nuts, but they actually tried to dose people left and right with LSD to try and control their minds. They experimented on humans. They killed them extra legally over and over and over again. But it is at this moment where that market, the idea that we're talking about with neoliberalism, the idea that what totally matters is the economy. And what does the government do in that case? Law enforcement and military. And those two actions are the only things that the government actually is responsible for. Everything else is left up to the market. Everything else is left up to chance. We pay our tax dollars so that we can be policed, so that we can be controlled, so that we can be surveilled. And that is the really disgusting deal of all this. And you're exactly right. That new part of this deal that we're talking about starts to take shape around there when the government decides the people are the enemy and that they must be crushed under any situation possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Jared Yates.
I want to read this question. BJ.
Yes.
BJ, let me question. It's at 213912 from one of the viewers, S. Urbana. It's a question for Jared that says, how do we go about catching people up so we don't get tuned out or labeled as the? And before Jared answers that, I would just like to say, I think that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. It's hard to really force people to learn what they don't want to learn. But what do you say, Jared?
Well, so just to put this into perspective, I think the problem in terms of explaining everything for so long has relied on a red and blue Democratic and Republican narrative, right? It's, oh, my person's perfect. Your person is the absolute worst. All we have to do is get a Democrat elected president and everything will be fine. It's trench warfare, right? But what I've always found is I can talk to anybody about this regardless of who they voted for. I can talk to Trump voters. And once you get beyond that blue-red dynamic and you start talking about power, you start talking about exploitation, you start talking about, the people who are able to control things and the people who are being controlled, what they'll do is they'll open up and they'll be like, you know what, I actually don't think Trump is all that great. I actually think Trump is kind of full of it. He's, kind of ridiculous. And I like the way that he upsets people, all of that. The point is, when you start talking to people about actual power, you start talking to people about what actually goes on, and you're informed about it in the way that we've been talking about today, it not only sounds right, it has the power of truth. And people recognize that from their own lives. They know that a billionaire grifter isn't going to go to the White House and represent them. They've been laid off from their jobs. right? Those same billionaires are the ones who moved their factories and sold everything out from underneath them and robbed their pensions. They know that it's BS. So if you start talking to them about actual politics, you start talking to them about actual power, they do start to understand. But that's not what the mass media does. That's not what these provocateurs do. That's not what the political parties do. But when we start talking individually, person to person, we build trust and we start building mutual understanding. And that's when you start having real conversations, when you move beyond that television show, cable news paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jared, it has been such a wonderful opportunity to have you join us tonight, and your insightfulness and your genius and critical thinking, connecting the dots between this book and this TV series, um, to where we are, where we've been, has been a wonderful opportunity, and we really want to thank you for
Well,
that.
I just want to say, and I mean this. I talk with a lot of people about this stuff, but I don't talk to enough people about it who take it seriously, who understand it. Right? There are so many people who do want to bury their heads in the sand. They don't want to talk about what is actually going on. This is a service that you are doing. This is really, really good work that you are doing, and I feel absolutely privileged and honored that you invited me on tonight. It really means a lot to me, and I wish you the best of luck. I think this is a worthwhile thing that you're doing.
Thank you so much, and we want people to know that you should follow.
Jared, do you know Frank Schaefer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, I talked to him not too long ago.
Okay, all right. If you don't know him, to come back. He's going to be here on January 27th, and I'd love to see you two in a conversation.
Yeah, we talked for his podcast a while back. We'd actually talked about doing some other stuff together. I think he has very, very invaluable things.
Frank is a longtime friend and voice at our Common Ground. And we are really excited to have him. Next week at If America Fails, we're going to be joined by Reverend Susan K. Smith and Cynthia Ann Bacon, who are going to be talking. Barron, I'm sorry. Who are going to be talking with us about cult and culture in the Handmaid's Tale. And we're really looking forward to having her. And we hope you'll join us. We have a chat room. You can all come into our studio and sit with us, Jared. And you're certainly invited to our Common Ground on Saturdays at 10 p.m. We do late night talk because talking late is when you can drink the bourbon.
That's right.
And get it all inside the pores there.
Well, I'm gonna pour myself a big glass and celebrate that we did this. But okay. I'll have to take you up on that one of these days.
Okay, thank you. And we'll see you next time. Michelle, it's been, I want to let people know in our audience how hard Michelle Odom, as senior producer of this series, has worked. And we are so grateful at TruthWorks Network for her hard work. We are a communications media company where we donate our time as our rent in this universe. But Michelle has paid double rent and has asked for no renovations, and we thank her so very much. Michelle, we'll see you next Thursday, and we'll be talking about the actual theme for next week.
Cultures and religion.
Yes.
Culture and religion.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we'll be
And
delving
thank you
into
to all of the viewers. Yeah, thank you to all of the viewers, all of your comments and questions. Hopefully I will get better as we move along um, at, at paying attention conversation. So we're on a little learning curve here. Thank you for joining
I know.
us.
And we'll see you next week. If America fails, let your friends know. Follow us on Twitter at TWN Talk. And the website is ifamericafails.live. And we'll be live right back here at 8 p.m. next Thursday night. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We're this going.
Seriously? What the actual